Good afternoon, everyone. Dear colleagues, dear students, a special thanks for joining us today for the second conference of the annual conference cycle organized by the CIECO Partnership, the new uses of collections in art museums. As head of the third axis of research, the expanded collection, as well as the UQO pole of the partnership, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we work, study, and live on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg Nation, the Nitakinan. We are pleased today, very pleased, to welcome our guest speaker, Catherine Wood, Senior Curator of International Art Performance at Tate Modern. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. This conference is organized as part of the third research axis activities, the expanded collection, that considers the new practices surrounding the musealization of artworks with a focus on the three main aspects of the musealization process, which are acquisition, archiving, and presentation of artworks. The defining role of contemporary art from the 1960s to up now is recognized as transformative for museum practices. This axis is particularly interested in atypical musealization processes and in artworks that defy conservation and display standards, just like performance art does, right? Which is a specialty of our guest. The first conference of the partnership by Boris Vastio, former director of the Musée d'Ethnographie de Genève, was organized by Professor Joan Lamoureux, chairholder of the Canada Research Chair in Civic Museology, and the partnership project director that is hosted by l'Université de Montréal. This conference was presented in collaboration with the Montreal Record Museum as part of the first research axis, the engaging collection activities. Boris Vastio's conference is now available on our YouTube channel. The third conference by Adila Laïda Anieh, director of the Palestinian Museum, will be held on April 13th. This conference will be hosted in collaboration with Galerie UQO by Marie Fraser, who holds the research chair in curatorial studies and practices. Marie Fraser is head of the second research axis, the exhibited collection, and the UQAM pole of the partnership. Our fourth and final conference for 2021, 2022, by Vince Deescan, senior scholar and research practitioner at Monash Art Design and Architecture, will be held in May. Date to confirm. This conference will be hosted by Emmanuel Chateau-Dutier, head of the fourth research axis, the shared collection, and of the digital cell ouvroir of the partnership, in collaboration with the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Today's conference by Catherine Wood is organized with a close collaboration with Galerie UQO, which I thanks, and its directors and curator, Marie-Hélène Leblanc, to whom I am very pleased to give the floor.
Merci Mélanie. Donc bonjour, il me fait vraiment plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette conférence organisée conjointement par la Galerie UQO et le partenariat CIECO des nouveaux usages des collections dans les musées d'art. It is a real honor for me to welcome Mrs. Catherine Wood for this conference entitled Have We Ever Been Modern? Things Performance Does to the Museum. D'abord, je tiens à souligner que la Galerie UQO reconnaît que ses activités se tiennent sur des terres faisant partie des territoires ancestraux non cédés de la nation algonquine. Founded in 2015 as a result of the establishment of a master's program in museology and art at UQO, Galerie UQO is a university art gallery that offers a space for reflection, a place for creation, and an academic tool by highlighting contemporary artistic and museum practice in Quebec, in Canada, and at a more international level as well. Galerie UQO has the mandate to support and promote the development of research and creation, but also artistic and museum training at the university. Galerie UQO supports and offers research and creation projects related to current issues in contemporary arts and museology. As part of the CIECO partnership, New Use of Collection in Art Museum, Galerie UQO is proud to collaborate in several activities precisely when it comes to conference and exhibition. Le projet de partenariat SIECO s'inscrit donc dans notre mandat, d'abord par la réflexion de nouveaux usages des collections muséales, mais aussi par son objectif de développement de nouveaux outils pouvant alimenter une coproduction du savoir sur les nouvelles pratiques muséales et leurs enjeux théoriques. Et finalement, par sa visée à favoriser un décloisonnement institutionnel entre les deux pôles qui supportent la discipline de l'histoire de l'art, le musée et l'université, là où intervient directement la galerie universitaire. Je terminerai en remerciant Joanne Lamoureux, chercheur principal responsable du partenariat, et Mélanie Boucher, co-chercheur et responsable de l'axe 3 du pôle UQO, de même que l'ensemble de l'équipe de chercheurs de SIECO. Je remercie également l'équipe de la Galerie UQO et je veux souligner l'appui indéfectible de l'Université du Québec en Outaouais dans le développement et les activités artistiques de la galerie. And thanks to you, Catherine Wood, to be with us today.
Thank you, Marie-Hélène. Now, let me introduce you to our guest speaker that you all know, Catherine Wood, Senior Curator of International Art Performance at Tate Modern. Catherine Wood holds a bachelor degree in English literature and history of art from Cambridge University, as well as a master degree in history of art at UCL with a specialization in modernism. During her master's studies, Catherine Wood obtained employment with Maureen Pelley, a pioneer of London's East End gallery scene. In 1998, she became an exhibitions organizer at the Barbican. In 2001, she joined the Tate curatorial team to program a live performance. She advocated for performance arts placed in art institutions. She has since been working to carve out a place for it in the Art Museum. Amongst other things, Catherine Wood curated exhibitions showcasing performance art. Already in 2007, she put together the exhibition The World as a Stage, a show that brought together a key group of international contemporary artists whose works investigates the idea of theater, staging, and performance. This was the first exhibition at Tate Modern to bring the realm of performance into dialogue with gallery-based work. She was behind the online broadcast project called BMW Tate Live Performance Room. The project was a series of performance streamed live across the world via Tate's website and YouTube channel. It then led on to Tate Modern's annual live exhibition in the Tanks, which began in 2016 and is still going. She is the author of the book Yvonne Rainer, The Mind is a Muscle, published in 2007 by After All and MIT, in which she examines the political and media context in which Rainer chose to use the dance theater situation and analyzes a radical approach to image making in live form. Catherine Wood also wrote Performance in Contemporary Art, published in 2018 by the Tate, where she proposes that performance is not a genre of art separate from object making, but rather an attitude that has infiltrated the field of contemporary art. Catherine Wood will consider today her work since the early 2000s with the contemporary generation whose transdisciplinary works are questioning traditional collecting, preservation, and exhibition practices. She will discuss a few case studies revealing atypical musealizations processes as they challenge the museum foundations. As I have said before in French, following Catherine Wood's presentation, we will have a period allotted to questions from the public, either in English or French, as you want. We ask, though, to use the chat section to ask your questions. That will help manage the questions. We will be able to give floor to some of your questions, but also to link questions depending on the number of questions and the time remaining for that period. So thank you very much. I will ask another time if people didn't close their mic to close their mic. And Catherine, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Melanie and Marie-Hélène as well, and all of your colleagues for so generously hosting me and inviting me today. It's really great to be here with you, and I love the directions you're taking in the questions that you're posing in your research. And I will try to think as I talk about what you said, Melanie, about the relations between acquisition, archiving, and presentation. I hope that will come through in the examples that I'll talk about. So what I'm going to talk about, as Melanie kindly said, was really drawing on my experience as a curator at Tate since in the past 20 years, actually. Time suddenly accelerated in the last 2 years, and here we are. And as somebody programming performance work in a museum that was not set up for liveness and bodies and performance, but really is set up as a place to look after objects and put objects on view. And so I'd like to talk a bit about the journey that I've been on with that work, bringing that work to the museum, to the Modern Art Museum, and also examples of how I've tried to collect, share, and show that work, and what those experiments with commissioning, collecting, exhibiting performance have done to help to shift museum protocols and values in certain ways. And I've found very often that each project by an artist brings its own challenges, which very often end up making adjustments to how we do things. So what is that relationship between the artist's vision, the museum setup, and the shifts in behavior and the kind of protocol that can affect, and how can that help to change the museum, and what does it do? I'm going to begin with an image from the very first thing that I programmed at Tate in 2003. And it was actually at the beginning of my work at Tate. I worked across both sites, the old Tate, which is Tate Britain, and Tate Modern, even though my work in the past 15 years has been exclusively really at Tate Modern. But this was the beginning, and I've chosen this image of a work by the artist Mark Leckey, London-based artist from Liverpool, because it's emblematic of the generation of artists that I was kind of coming of age with, and emblematic of an approach to performance in the museum that really was formative in my thinking about what that encounter between the artist making a live work and the museum collection can be. And I'm bringing this up even though it happened so long ago, because it's taken me 20 years, I think, to really understand the implications of this work too. So I find it very useful as a marker of how practice has shifted and how museum protocol has shifted since then. And Leckey is characteristic, I think, of a generation that I'll go on to talk about others that we collected, but artists in London in that period in the early 2000s, artists like him alongside Monster Chetwynd, collective called Hobby Pop, David Thorpe, many younger artists were really thinking about how their practice might not be performance art in a kind of classic body art sense, but rather how could they inhabit the image? How could a material practice of painting or making sculpture create situations that were to do with shared gathering or shared witness to the work instead of conventional gallery display? They were often really not paying attention to the conventional disciplinary boundaries that modernism or even postmodernism in certain ways reinforced. There's a kind of undisciplined approach to transgressing, whether it was music, dance, visual art, or theatre. And so also not adherence to a kind of medium specificity. And I'd like to think about how that generation in their experiments and bringing them into the museum has since then, as I go through my talk, also paved the way for social practice and the work that we've done collecting or beginning in the past 5 years at Tate Modern to collect work by First Nations, Indigenous artists, how the unsettling of museum practice through artists' interest in performance and live work has helped to pave the way for being able to engage with and collect those practices since then. So how did a work like this, titled Big Box Statue Action, made in 2003, start to help me as a curator imagine the museum as a social space rather than a space of display, but as a place of gathering, a place of ritual and remembering and also imagining, and how the transhistorical is such an important part of that. This work, so when I invited the artist to make this piece, I'd seen his work more often presented in artist-run spaces or even nightclub or kind of pub spaces, a car park in Soho, spaces that were not conventional museum spaces by any means. And I had some trepidation in the idea of inviting an artist who was working in that way into the museum. And of course, performance art proper was often very much anti-museum, anti-market, explicitly positioned as being contradictory to what this, especially this space, the neoclassical central galleries of the old Tate Gallery, Tate Britain, represent. But it was very interesting the way that Mark Leckey embraced that opportunity, and like Tino Segal and others, is of a generation after the 1960s and 70s generation who might have rejected being inside the museum in this way, thinking about how to find a place in relation to art history, or what their relationship is, whether it's reciprocal or antagonistic, which in the case of this work, it was kind of both. So Mark Leckey asked me to organize that for the performance he wanted to do, that we could borrow a work from the Tate collection, a very famous work that had often been on display, this sculpture by Jacob Epstein from the 1930s called Jacob and the Angel, a sculpture that's absolutely emblematic of British modernism, an idea of truth to materials, the revelation of the rock, the alabaster, also an idea of what was known as kind of primitivist reference to sculpture making that was also characteristic of that period of work. And Leckey decided to have a sound system made that would mimic the exact proportions of the sculpture. So he had it built to match the size and scale of the Epstein work. He'd hoped to put the Epstein work on the floor of the gallery, but our conservators wouldn't let it be taken off its plinth. So he had his sculpture, his sound system on plinth too, opposite. But the idea for him was to effect a kind of conversation between a music composition that he made that was 20 minutes long and the sculpture. And he said that he wanted to try to coax a response out of this giant silent piece of stone sculpture, to try and seduce it, but also partly the sound piece was really loud, almost a kind of attack, and I was actually terrified in my new job at Tate that the sculpture might explode when the volume went up, so I was watching it with bated breath. But what he made was this incredible sound work with a group of people gathering after hours in the museum. The rest of the museum was silent and dark, and this gathering took place around a sculpture that people usually walk past and glance at. And in our visitor surveys at Tate, people often, apparently, rather depressingly, only look at artworks for an average of 2 seconds or something. So he made this staging of a time period to look at the work through music, through a composition of 20 minutes. And a sense of seeing each other in this circle. You can only see a section of it here, but a sense that we were there gathered to witness something. And in the composition, I found it interesting now I think about it in retrospect, that as well as sampling dance music and composing his own music, he included elements of referencing Christian ritual, I guess, not from a point of view of being religious, but he had a sample of Handel's Messiah. And Jacob and the Angel is a Bible story. And in the narrative of modernism or the modern art museum, obviously religious and spiritual belief is typically perhaps referenced as a story, you know, that might have at one point underwritten something, but not something you would feel or invest in any live sense. But the artist in this case created a composition that was kind of aiming at a feeling of transcendence, not in necessarily believing in the Christian story. In fact, definitely not, but borrowing its spiritual associations and creating this uplifting feeling. And you can't see in the picture, but there's a glass domed roof above this that also created this kind of church-like or cathedral-like feeling. And what was formative about this work for me was the way that he took, it created a kind of temporary community around an artwork and an idea of community as a group of people communing with the artwork. And especially in terms of what I wanted to talk about today, it really paved the way for challenging those exclusions of so-called universal modernism and what being modern is. As we know, according to Bruno Latour, it's that separation of nature and culture, or science from spirituality. It's a denial of ancient or indigenous or religious belief in favor of rationalism, and a belief in autonomy and progress and linear time as opposed to cyclical or kind of located experience and time. So in a sense, this was a modest intervention, but it did, for 20 minutes, give this experience of a museum that could be very different, a museum that could be located in a place much more specifically and located in shared time between people. And in that sense, it was very important to me in terms of how to go forward working in the museum. So I shift here to an image of a project we did at Tate Modern in 2015, just to begin really by thinking about working in a museum like Tate Modern, which is essentially a place for people, full of people, even though, well, I'm showing a few images of Tate full of people. So here it is with Boris Sharmat's If Tate Modern Was Musée La Danse, a temporary transformation of the whole museum into the dancing museum, and part of his own ongoing 10-year project, the Musée de la Danse. But at Tate Modern, he said, imagine if in the entire museum, the choreography of bodies was looked at through spectacles that inflected all movement as a kind of choreography or dance. What would that museum look like? What role would the objects play, and how would they exist in relation to, you know, the audience as a body of people who are engaging in pedestrian movement or choreography or dance workshops? What would that shift do? So that was an experiment. But really, I'm showing this image and others. That's another one of a workshop that he did. All these images showing Tate Modern as not the white cube gallery that it also contains, but a space for gathering as its kind of basis. This is a work by Paola Pivi, where she got 1,000 people to scream together on the bridge as a kind of living sculpture in 2010, I think it was. A project curated by Claire Tancon, using or sort of exploiting the street-like and public space, public square-like nature of the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern to do a project working with artists, including this artist Marlon Griffiths, who make carnival procession, which she thinks of as a kind of processional exhibition form that had been excluded from mainstream art institutions typically, and as a kind of a form of art that the Black community in London and many other cities here made because of that exclusion, made in the street and in public space. So I messed up my slide. Other artists that we've showed more recently have again worked into the public and the kind of people-filled nature of the museum that Tate is by thinking about hosting, in the work of Isabel Lewis, she performs as a host and really thinks about people not as the mind on legs of, as what Tony Bennett says, the viewer in the modern art museum is, not the disembodied eye that Brian O'Doherty talks about, but as bodies, sensuous bodies who need food, who can smell and taste as well as touch, who can dance, who like to be amongst organic, materials, the excluded sensuality and organic dimensions of the subject, again, that modernism and the white cube deny. So Isabel Lewis there, or Anna Imhoff, who really makes work that sculpts attention by working into the crowd as a kind of given, rather than imagining the empty space as a display space for her paintings. So what does it mean to work into people as your kind of architecture of attention, rather than just imagining objects in space? I've muddled my slides slightly there, but so gathering, ritual, this communing with art were bases for my own entry point into working as a curator in a museum, all the while trying to weave the story of why artists were working with liveness, with bodies, with performance, into an existing narrative of modern and contemporary art that's the basis of Tate Modern's identity and its the nature of its collection. And so one of the other significant things in parallel with this staging of events was really thinking about what it would mean to collect that work, because I felt that the danger of experimenting only with event-based live work in the museum is that it would remain in the kind of afterthought side of kind of public programming, on the side of how the museum understood its core mission, and its core mission and the core narrative being embodied in the collection. So there were a number of artists in the early 2000s that I mentioned already. Tino Segal, who I don't have images of because he's so strict about not showing images of the work, for good reason, to preserve its authenticity as an oral tradition that gets passed on and transmitted as movement and gesture and word. But a number of artists, including Tino and also Roman Ondak, who used, see if I've got that image, who used, and here's a work by David Lamelas as well, a historic work, but really Tanya Bruguera, Tino, Roman Ondak started making work in the early 2000s that was collectible as a score. And what I'd like to talk about really is how thinking about the museum as a space for people primarily, not just, as Charles Escher of Van Abbe Museum has described it, not a treasure box for precious things, but a space for people and full of people, a public space. I want to talk about collecting these performances as a score, and then how that has enabled us to think differently about the objects in the collection, sometimes thinking of objects themselves as a score, and also how we have taken different approaches to understanding the liveness of the historic collection, which is often latent or hidden. So certain kinds of painting, action painting, butai. And at the end, I'd like to talk a bit about artists who have really thought about immaterial transmission, not only Boris Sharmat's in Musée de la Danse, but artists thinking about alternative oral histories and forms of custodianship and alternative values to collecting, alternative approaches to collecting. So Tanya Bruguera's Tatlin's Whisper was one of the early works, alongside works by Roman Ondak and Tino Segal, that we managed to acquire for the collection through forms of contract, or in Tino's case, oral transmission, that would give us the rights to perform the work as a score, that could then be reenacted. And I've been very lucky at Tate Modern to have a fantastic time-based media department who've been extremely open-minded as to the definition of what time-based media is. So through that work, we were able to bring in these different artworks. Tanya Bruguera's piece, in this case, Tatlin's Whisper 5, which is a choreography performed by 2 members of the Mounted Metropolitan Police in London, who perform 6 crowd control exercises within the public space. So again, working into the crowd. And they perform this exercise of power to no particular end. So it's a pure kind of demonstration of the power to corral the crowd, to command the crowd. Tanya, her specification for the work is that the piece should only be shown when there's living memory of those mounted police being used in a kind of riot or crowd control situation in the city in which it's shown, which unfortunately has been an ongoing possibility in London. We've shown it twice since we acquired it. She also keeps an archive of iterations of the piece when it's shown in different places. And we had an interesting conversation about a loan of the piece potentially to San Francisco, who don't use mounted police on horses, but use motorbikes. So her understanding of the piece is that when it switches context, you would use the appropriate form of police riot control in that place. But yeah, so the work behaves like any other work and can be loaned in similar ways. Similarly, David Lamelas's work, Time, from 1970, involves the artist or a designated person going to visitors and asking them to join this line, this timeline, and each person it begins at the end of the line where somebody reads out the time from either their watch or nowadays their phone and holds the time for a minute before passing it on to the next person in the line, but they do so from their own timepiece and in their own language. So it creates this rather beautiful texture of time down the line, a kind of uneven texture of individual times shared. And he did a beautiful version actually 2 years ago online, which was a very different experience than doing it in real life, because online time, I don't know if you agree, but it has a different density and a different feeling. A minute feels potentially longer online, but it also gave a sense, there people could join the online version from different timelines, from different time zones, I mean. So I'm mentioning these 2 works as scores because the working with our conservators to bring in immaterial works like these that rely on written instructions, in the case of Lamelas and Bruguera. In the case of Tino Segal's work, This is Propaganda, it relied purely on an oral contract with the artist. He wanted nothing written down because he did not want the contract or the instruction piece in the kind of Fluxus sense to be put in a vitrine in a gallery and shown as the work. He wanted the work always to be enacted, only enacted. It had to be enacted for 6 months at a time, 6 weeks at a time minimum, so it didn't become an event, but that it would have a presence more akin to showing a sculpture or any other work. And he was very clever about specifying these conditions, which gave the work a different kind of status and presence, and it was part of that transition from performance being this sideshow perhaps, or this kind of after hours event, to being something that would be in the main galleries alongside other material works and being in dialogue with them. The work's fragile in a sense because it's not written down and recorded, you could say, but actually the way he works is a little bit more like the kind of répétiteur model of ballet, where he has expert people that will travel to implement the work, travel by train only, because he was early on in thinking about sustainability not only in the form of his work, but in how it gets transmitted and travels. So he has individuals who can relay and teach the work to people who then enact it. And we had this one work in the collection, and then he did the Turbine Hall commission with a much larger group of interpreters that he worked with in 2012. So what did bringing those score works, performance score works into the collection do to our thinking about other objects in the museum? And when we opened the tanks in 2016, instead of just programming, they are spaces, these beautiful 2 large round underground concrete chambers underneath the new Blavatnik building in Tate Modern, and they used to hold giant metal oil containers for when the building used to be a power station. And they were converted in 2016 into spaces that we can use for performance, film, and installation. And there are 2 smaller transformer galleries as well. But when we opened these spaces, I didn't want to simply show live work in a theatre space, perhaps like distinguishing it from how the theatre space at the Pompidou works in Paris, where the programme in the theatre is quite distinct from what happens in the galleries upstairs. So we were really thinking how to bring this question of how performance or liveness, how bodies and live attention are entangled with material objects in the collection, and are in fact reciprocally meaningful into these spaces, and how to connect it to what's in the galleries upstairs. And so we put 3 works in this display. Oh, because I'd wanted to mention this beautiful work as well by Li Mingwei that we acquired, and that we'll be doing a major presentation of in May and June this year. But again, a score-based work that is called Our Labyrinth, and it involves performers sweeping rice in this beautiful kind of Zen painting-like configuration as a choreography. But so these images of the tanks in 2016 were where I tried to show sculpture that really should have been understood in performative terms as a score, but had been collected and shown as material objects. And so there were 3 works from 1968 in this display. Robert Morris's Mirror Cubes, Rashid Areen's Zero to Infinity, and at the back there, Charlotte Pozanenska's work, Revolving Vein. And when Robert Morris had visited us some years ago, we did a reenactment of his 1971 participatory show from the old Tate. He was upset that the mirror cubes were shown behind barriers, given that the whole emergence of his work, and this was for me what I actually studied in my MA on modernism. I ended up writing my thesis on Judson dance theatre and Yvonne Rainer, and really on the fundamental basis in dance and theatre that minimalist sculpture had, which had been kind of, again, repressed from view in my version of postmodern art history and minimalist art history, all by men, which really had grown out of experiments with Simone Forti, Trisha Brown, and Yvonne Rainer. So Robert Morris had said, why are you at Tate showing this mirror cube sculpture as an authentic object that's precious behind barriers, when the whole point of it is that you walk in between them to see your body reflected and refracted? It's a performative work. It's not a precious object. You can go down to the local DIY store and remake those cubes if they break. You know, it doesn't matter that I touched them in my studio 40 years ago. It is a participatory live work, and it needs to be treated more like a prop than as a precious material work. Similarly, Rashid Areen's Zero to Infinity was always conceived, and I've got an image here of Venice that happened the following year, but was always conceived as a choreographic sculpture, which was intended for people to move the cubes around. And again, once it had come into the Tate collection, it started being treated as a sculpture that one couldn't touch, and that prohibition on touch, on interaction, dominated the desire for the artist's idea of what was authentic about the work. So these works, and with Poznanska, similarly, we had a prototype for her revolving vane sculpture that she'd made in the studio, but her conception for the work was always that they could be multiply replicated in cheap materials, in plywood, and they were to be interacted with. The doors open and close, and they provide and create these kind of platforms for people to pass through, to be within, to kind of hide in. It was amazing showing them. We got permission from her estate to, instead of show the authentic prototype that we owned, to replicate the works 3 times. And my favorite moment was at the opening of the 2016 building, when we had this day when we had 3,000 school children visit Tate Modern. They were the first visitors for the new building. And they ran through the tanks and were running in and out of these doors, this incredible energy of hundreds of tiny people running in and through the Poznanska sculptures and kind of activating them like I imagine she would have loved. But then people also used them through the run in much more sober ways, or as kind of darkroom spaces to make out in. All kinds of ways people invented of using those. But I guess the learning from the museum from these works was that history of performance, which with all these artists had originally been a part of, entangled with, aspired to, had been kind of ironed out by the museum's treasure box approach to preserving the material objects as being the authentic work, and the idea of authenticity around the work. And how could we, not by caring for them less, and not by taking our role as custodians and carers for the legacy of those artists any less seriously, but how can we create encounters with that work that is more authentic in terms of what the artists had originally intended? So part of that work for me as a curator has been going back to the artists' estates, or the artist, in the case of Rashid Areen, he's still very much alive and well in London, talking to the artists about how we can work with, how, you know, the permissions we can have to remake that work, how we can also display that side of it. And you can see a board in the back here that Rashid had specified, where photographs of the interactions with his cubes as they were moved and replaced and rearranged by visitors could be displayed and put up as the piece evolves. And just mentioning a work that we showed in parallel in that space, you can't see in this image, but on the other side of the space, we showed a fantastic work by the contemporary artist Tara Katui, which in a similar way thinks about this question of how the material object relates to not just the concept, but the content of a work, in his case with musical instruments. And here's a picture of him with a number of musicians from London playing these instruments that he had made based as kind of vessels, based on a set of ethnographic instruments that he recorded. He got permission to record in the Ethnographic Museum in Dahlem in Berlin. And he took the sound from those instruments, which may not have been played for hundreds or thousands of years, but had been carefully looked after. He collected the sound and had contemporary instrument makers make new instruments which would replicate that sound. And his question in this work was, how can, you know, the work is a collection of sounds. His work as a musician was prioritizing the sound and interested in allowing those sounds, those unique sounds, to persist through time, a kind of museum of sound. And he just made these new vessels for the sound so that audiences now can hear those sounds, but the vessels are less important to him than the carrier, than just, you know, being carriers for sounds that he wants to preserve and transmit and experiment with, playing with other musicians and bringing those sounds to life. So we've had objects, we've had performance scores, which led us to look at the objects as scores, to kind of think differently about the value of material objects in relation to the social, and to readdress that balance, actually. So from those experiments and explorations, when I've been working on our collection displays, one of the things, and through an exhibition I did called A Bigger Splash, Painting After Performance, been thinking a lot more about how we might tell this hidden history of performance that underwrites many of the objects. I was mentioning that in relation to minimalism, but also in relation to painting. Obviously, we know that Jackson Pollock's legacy, according to Alan Capro, was so much informed by the films of him made by Hans Namath, and equally, and even more so actually, in the case of the Gutai group, we had this painting on the right by Shimamoto in the collection, a painting from the 1950s. And we were lucky in the past few years to acquire a beautiful portfolio of Otsuji photographs of Gutai live performance works and Gutai on the stage. And actually, we made a display last year of the Gutai group that really tried to show the radical nature of their performative experimentation and how narrowly, I mean, as the major Gutai exhibition at the Guggenheim did very well, but to kind of shift the narrative that had otherwise persisted, including in how our Shimamoto paintings were being shown as, at worst, derivative of American abstract expressionism, but even at best, sort of dabbling in action painting, rather than the incredible experiments with theatrical image making and making art in space and time that the Gutai group did, and which was incredibly broad and well beyond the action painting aspect that was related to Jackson Pollock. So we were looking specifically, we had the chance last year, after Tate Modern reopened through the pandemic, to experiment with a new kind of programming. And as I've said, I've always been really interested in the public nature, the kind of public square that is the Turbine Hall, the fact that it is such an open, there's no fee to pay to come into the museum. It is this quite, although there are barriers to entry that we work on from an outreach point of view, of course, I'm not naive to that, but there is a flow from the street into the museum, and it is a park-like space in a sense, which presents challenges and also opportunities. And with this display of the Gutai group on upstairs, some of the research that we were doing into that and conversations with the Japanese American art historian Ming Tiampo, who's on our Hyundai Tate Research Council, we were looking at the Gutai group's work, not only their experiments on stage with making these incredible performances using smoke and materials and shooting arrows into painting, and obviously Tanaka's light bulb dress, all those iconic works, but maybe their lesser known work with children and with the question of play. And this was something we'd been thinking about, especially after the pandemic at Tate Modern, the fact that everybody had been kind of cramped in their rooms for so long, isolating at home, especially children being very confined for a long time. And we were thinking about a new strand of programming that might use the Turbine Hall as an open participatory space, but really wanting to locate that in artists' vision and artists' experiments with art, you know, from an art historical point of view. So we were looking at the 1956 outdoor exhibition that Gutai Group did in Ashia Park, in Japan. And this work in particular, Please Draw Freely by Yoshihara, which encouraged children to come and draw on a board, draw whatever they wanted to draw, but was really part of a bold and experimental approach to making an art exhibition in an outdoor public park under the trees, with all kinds of participatory dimensions to it, walking on the work, seeing the work strung amongst the trees, an idea that anybody and everybody passing by might be intrigued and come and join into the work. And it's very much in a way in line with what Tate aspires to. So I've worked before with the fantastic Japanese American artist Ei Arakawa, who's done a lot of work, research into the Japanese avant-garde, and often played with it and reinterpreted it in a contemporary context. And we worked with him on imagining a remake of Please Draw Freely, but in his vision, he turned the whole of the Turbine Hall into this giant drawing board. Instead of just making a board, we did make some boards that went outside and on the bridge inside Tate. But he had an idea to allow people to come in and just draw all over the floor, and he put these trees in as a kind of marker of the park place. Also, interestingly, told me that the placing of the Gutai outdoor exhibition in a park with these trees, which were typical of the theatre design for no theatre, had always historically given it this kind of traditional Japanese theatre inflection. So he brought the no theatre trees into our space and opened it up for people. And it was this incredible level of participation in drawing, but also collective endeavor. So this was a point where he's showing the Yoshihara Zero painting, which people participated in making together on the floor with these black crayons. And the banners hanging above were a reference to also one of the Gutai exhibitions, the Sky exhibition, where these collectively made paintings were hung from balloons, helium balloons in the sky, which we didn't do for environmental reasons, but we hung them from the ceiling. So I'm just showing this as an example of how in a participatory mode and working closely, very closely with our learning and families team, we were able to open up art history, open up the artifacts on display in the galleries upstairs to this mode of encounter and really the spirit of Gutai I guess in a way that was much more palpable than simply showing the documentation. And equally, we had a display of the beautiful Otsuji photographs of the Gutai on the stage in 1956 and 57, and this Motonaga work, Smoke, which involved smoke rings being projected through coloured light to a soundtrack. We also worked with the Motonaga estate to get permission to restage that as well in the Turbine Hall. I mentioned at the beginning that when I was studying modernism in my MA, as you mentioned in my CV, I was fascinated by those relations between minimalist sculpture and postmodern dance in New York in the downtown scene. And I felt, you know, my writing on Yvonne Rainer was very much about bringing the input of those mostly women or women, female and queer artists, making the choreography that made sense of the minimal objects, which I would argue were more props for their dance than valuable things in themselves. The Morris early sculptures were absolutely made as props for Simone Forti and Yvonne Rainer. But this is a work that we've brought into the collection recently in a similar vein when I co-curated the 2017 Rauschenberg retrospective with my colleague Achim Burkhardt-Hume. We tried to show how formative, you know, contrary to the myth of the autonomous object, how formative working in theatre space and working with choreographers in particular had been for Rauschenberg. And he'd had that at least a decade of working with Merce Cunningham on making props for his theatre stage productions after the Black Mountain College moment. And always it was a space of mutual kind of egging on of what could they do next, how could they challenge each other's practice. Rauschenberg got Merce Cunningham to dance with a chair strapped to his back. He put live animals on stage. He put props on stage that would become kind of obstacles to the dance often. And similarly, in his decade of working with Trisha Brown, there was this incredible reciprocal permission that they gave each other to push their practices further and to work together in creating objects and dances that would initiate new kinds of experience on stage. So in our exhibition, we represented a previous work called Glacial Decoy, in which Rauschenberg had made projections that would work with Trisha Brown's dance. But when the Trisha Brown company was beginning to wind down after Trisha Brown sadly passed away, they began looking for the potential to place some of these works that had been made for her dancers. And we were very lucky to be able to acquire this shiner, elastic carrier shiner that Rauschenberg had made for her seminal work, Set and Reset in 1983, which has a soundtrack by Laurie Anderson. And Rauschenberg had made the sculpture, this triangular and square projection structure, which has stock news footage projected onto it. And he thought of it as a kind of living set. He never wanted his artworks, which all have moving parts and wheels and clocks and things embedded in them, as you probably know. But equally with the sets, he wanted them to have a live presence that would complement the dance on stage. And he also had screen printed the beautiful costumes that the dancers wear. I was slightly horrified from a museum point of view, having said all these things about authentic objects or objects in use, that the Trisha Brown company told me they were still touring with the original sculpture, not only the sculpture, but the hand screen printed costumes that Rauschenberg had done himself. I couldn't help thinking about the value of his screen prints in other terms. But it's kind of beautiful that they've been wearing them. There are two sets and touring around with it. And that in this context, the value of those things is utterly different than in the market or in the kind of white glove, acid-free paper context of the museum. They've been lived in and living ever since he made them, and that's what he had intended. So we've now brought them in, and the rules change a little bit, but really the idea is to keep working with this as a live entity. So we have the work on display at the moment. This is a more recent, that was a historic image of the work in 1983, and a recent image with Trisha Brown Company performing it. But we have this display on right now in the tanks, which I don't have a brilliant image. We've acquired the sculpture, some fantastic building tapes, which I see as like the equivalent of the kind of Cézanne sketches to the main painting. Building tapes from Trisha Brown's studio, where you see her working out the dance originally with Stephen Petronio and others. And then some photographs and the costumes, and a beautiful film of the piece being premiered at BAM in New York in 1983 with Laurie Anderson playing the soundtrack live. And so we have the work on display in the tanks as a kind of archive with the Rauschenberg sculpture as a centerpiece, but then to really make it meaningful as an acquisition in London and as a live work that we've acquired, not just an archive. We've been working with two different dance companies based in London, Rambert Dance Company, who are our neighbours on the south bank of the Thames, who Trisha Brown Company came and taught the piece to them. So that transmission of the knowledge became part of the acquisition to the bodies of young dancers, fantastic group of young dancers who who performed the work and who now know it and would be able to re-perform it. And I mean, that will have an organic quality to it in terms of how long that will last, or how long. There's also a licensing thing around dance, but nevertheless, it's nice to know that they've been the first company who've been allowed to learn it other than, or perform it, I mean, in its original form, apart from the Trisha Brown company. So we have that in London as a possibility, and we did a series of performances with them. And then there's a version of the work called Set and Reset, which is a slightly adapted version, which other companies have been able to learn. And one of the fantastic companies who learned it is Canduco, a company who've worked with disabled and non-disabled dancers in London for 30 years. And they do a beautiful version, which to my mind brings out Trisha Brown's roots in pedestrian choreography with Yvonne Rainer in the 60s, much more vividly actually than the perfectly trained bodies of a Rambert dance. And it, you know, Joel Brown, the dancer you see using a wheelchair there, does this incredible improvisation in the piece, using the chair, resonating with Rauschenberg's love of rotors and motion and velocity. And it brought a whole new energy to the piece to see this interpretation of it too. So we've been able to use the display. I guess this is what I want to say in museum terms. We've used the display as a kind of host space, a space of possibility, not just as a springboard in the way that the Gutai works were to a public participation, but as a host space for things to happen and grow in, and for interpretations of the work to be live, and also to have this legacy in London. And this is just an image of a third part to the project, which is called Set and Reset, Unset. And you can't see here, but two of the Rambert dancers are coming at regular intervals to perform elements of the choreography. It was designed by the Trisha Brown dancer who taught the dance, Carolyn Brown. And Karen Lucas, sorry, Carolyn Brown was an original Judson dancer. And she has selected footage of Trisha Brown talking about her approach to composition, and voiceover of Trisha Brown whilst they do this kind of lecture demo version. So that will be, this is a group of people just of an afternoon looking at that in a more formal way and less as a dance event in itself. So I think I've just got a few more minutes, but I wanted to really conclude with mentioning a few artists. I said at the beginning that in the past 5 years, Tate's begun, after this period in 15 years of collecting performance and moving towards a capacity for collecting immaterial practices. We've also been collecting some work by First Nations and Indigenous artists, which have really built on, I mean, this won't be news to you. I'm sure you all know more about this than I do. And from a point of view of being in Canada, Tanya Lukin Linklater no doubt will be very familiar. But I just wanted to mention a project that we began in March 2020, which was tragically the week that lockdown happened and was cancelled. But I feel the spirit of it was so strong in the institution that it had an incredible presence, even though it didn't really happen. But the seeds of ideas that the project planted, these were two of the artists in the project, Tanya Lukin Linklater and Faustin Linyekula. And the project was titled My Body, My Archive. Or Our Bodies, Our Archives, actually. It was after Faustin's title in the singular. And each of the artists in different ways were really extending that question of collecting the immaterial or collecting performance in their own practices. Faustin talks explicitly about the idea that in a performance situation, as a dancer and as a poet, he could summon histories in his own body that would not be collectible in another form. They're not about what's written down in books. It's not about objects that might be preserved in the museum, but what can he summon from histories that aren't necessarily manifest in forms that the museum would recognize, and how can he bring that into a space, into the kind of Enlightenment model museum, and into dialogue with objects in the museum. So he was posing many important questions that kind of rock the foundations of the museum's modern self-understanding. And equally, as I'm sure you know, Tanya Lukin-Linklater's work and the way that she draws attention to traditions, especially the beautiful way that she writes her poetry and brings visually these images of clothing, jewelry, tradition and cultural forms that are passed down a female line, especially. And that idea that collectability is maybe less important than this passing on of tradition and of craft and of practice. And it absolutely goes against the modernist trajectory that's all about innovation and kind of smashing, innovation and originality trumping any sense of continuity or collaboration. And there is a gendered politics to this, which I think Tanya, and in that insistence on, and the poetry writing about her aunties and the female line really brings that out in a powerful way, as does indeed Cecilia Vicuna, who is our next Turbine Hall commission. So I think these artists, artists beginning to work with performance 50 years ago, and the next generation that I encountered in my formative years 20 years ago had been kind of whispering these things, and the whispers are definitely getting louder and clearer and really beginning to make sense in ways that challenge what we do and where we think the value is. And I just wanted to end with an image of a work that we did not acquire, that we became custodians of last year, a work by an artist from Guatemala, Cachinquel artist of the Mayan community called Edgar Calel. And this is a work that he conceives of as a ritual that takes the form of rocks with cut fruit, which have a ceremony performed on them at the point of display, where the fruit's cut and alcohol's poured on them and a blessing takes place. But I just wanted to mention as an endpoint his conception for how a museum might take a work like this into its collection. And his idea, or his invitation to us, was that we could become custodians of this work, and that the agreement for custodianship would last for 14 years. And after that period, he said, the work could either be returned to the earth, because the work only ever belonged to the earth anyway, the rocks and the fruit, nobody owned it, or we could pass it to another institution in Europe as to be custodians for the next 14 years with the same specifications, or we could lend a work from Tate collection, which I love, to his community, and we could have a reciprocal agreement about taking care of each other's works. And I really love, again, what he proposes, and if we really listen to it, what that implies in terms of what we're doing as a public institution with works. How are the works in our collection, rather than the treasure box, how are they a resource that we have collective responsibility to look after? How do we manifest that collective responsibility, rather than the kind of you're not allowed to touch it situation, which, I don't deny in a public museum, there's a reason why we put barriers around things to preserve them. But I think works like this, that the logic of these works and the promise of these works is something that is indicating how much we've repressed with that way of doing things, I guess. So how is the museum a shared resource and a space for co-imagining the future with that sense of collective responsibility, which is so important anyway in this age of climate emergency? How do we work together on a model of, you know, reflecting on the past through having these works there, but understanding our reciprocal relationship with them and all that that implies? I think I'll stop there, but thank you.